Carter was all about, and this is why I love her, Carter was all about artistic disobedience with aesthetic flair and intellectual depth. Better than food, man. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Great to see you as always. Hope you're doing well. Get that coffee. All right. Today's review is of an old favorite and a perfect Halloween book. Today is The Bloody Chamber by the English author Angela Carter, published in 1979. This is actually a re-review, technically, of one of the earliest reviews I ever did, which must have been approximately 9 years ago. I'm shooting this on the 24th. Better Than Food is actually 9 years old tomorrow on the 25th. So I haven't read this in at least a decade. And it's just as good, if not better, than when I first came across it. It's a marvelous book. This is a collection of 10 short stories, most of them retellings of famous folk tales or fairy tales. Angela Carter was an eccentric product of the 60s and 70s, a self-identified feminist who nevertheless didn't really seem to fit into any of the categories under that label, especially by today's standards. Rules, in general, seemed anathema to her. She seemed to enjoy breaking them, playing with convention. She grew up in post-war England after the Blitz. So I imagine it was a really dark time, dark environment, with a not domineering mother, but it seemed at least, but kind of like an infantilizing mother, like one that like wants to keep you a kid for way too long, longer than is appropriate, you know what I mean? So that was a weird situation for her growing up. So it sounds like she kind of had to pry herself away from that situation and built up this thick skin. Inspired by Gothic literature, it also seems she was inspired by French literature, Sigmund Freud, and the Marquis de Sade. So all these tales of dark fantasy and dark sexuality and death and horror, the eerie and morbid, as well as her socio-political concerns as a woman in 1960s and 70s England, went to inform this collection. She also spent 2 years in Tokyo and was apparently a fan of Yukio Mishima. I think she actually wrote something on him, which I have yet to read, but I'd like to. So, very interesting character indeed. Now look, listen to me. You just trust me, and if this is your first time here, just know, usually I read what could be referred to as serious literature, so just wait. Don't run or don't cut me off and switch the tab when I tell you the synopsis for this book, okay? Because if you're like me, the minute you hear what this is, it's going to make your mouth twist like, Moving on to things worthwhile. It's a serious literature. Now you just sit down and unsaddle your goddamn horse. Cheers if you get that. This is a collection of well-known fairy tales and French folk tales by Charles Perrault and or the Brothers Grimm, I think. They might have had their own variations on like Little Red Riding Hood. I'm not sure about the others. All of them retold through a much more adult, feminine-centric, surreal or magical realist lens, often inverting the power balance between the sexes from the original stories. Almost all of these narratives feature a female protagonist, save for one, which is Puss in Boots. And it's often female protagonists in the originals, I think, though I don't think I've actually read them. But I assume they're in a more kind of traditionally surface-level, one-dimensional manner. So Carter, who sometimes writes in the first-person point of view as well, brings a whole rich and complex internal world to these female characters. Often it seems like they're going through a period of feminine maturation, their coming-of-age stories, filled with chaotic happenings, filled with turmoil because, quite understandably, it's not at all what was anticipated, given the fantastical nature of the stories. Carter's women find themselves in all sorts of adventurous nightmares. For example, one character is married off to Bluebeard, in the eponymous story. Another is courted by a werewolf. It's a wonder it doesn't lead to immense psychological turmoil. Because they always seem to have a grip on things, which is sometimes humorous because those who would otherwise take advantage of a helpless damsel often find themselves facing a rather unsuspectingly competent opponent. Speaking of, though, if you yourself are experiencing psychological turmoil, and given current events, why wouldn't you be? I certainly am. It's not like we're about to go to war with China, Russia. Never mind the inflation, the broken American dream, the issues with drugs and homelessness, and also the suicide record and the deaths of despair, and most importantly of all, of course, goes without saying, the sriracha shortage. I found a bottle the other day, don't tell anybody, it was amazing. But no, seriously, if you yourself are stressed out or experiencing some sort of mental health issue and would like to get a grip on it, I'd like to suggest some options. Because it's a really hard time, and it's just getting worse, right? You know, it will get better. In the interim, it might get a little bit worse. That's okay. We have tools to handle that. A couple of things that I enjoy would be proper diet, nutrition, and weight training, or exercise, Even just incline walking for me does wonders. Another method is meditation. Hot yoga is pretty rad, actually. Another method would be therapy. So in that case, I'd like to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and more accessible, which is helpful because Finding a therapist can be really hard when you're limited to the slim options, potentially, in your area, especially if you're in an area that is considerably rural. But this is why BetterHelp is helpful, because you can go anywhere in the world, and as long as you have an internet connection, then you can have access to your therapist. They make finding a therapist easy because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions online, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist in as little as just a few days. And it's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description below. It's betterhelp.com/BTF. Clicking on that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month with BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if that helps you. And because finding a therapist is a little bit like dating, if you don't initially fit with a therapist, which is a common thing in therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without worrying about insurance or who's in your network or anything like that. So if you're struggling right now, and let's face it, who isn't, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Go ahead and click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/BTF. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. The one departure from the feminine point of view would be her version of Puss in Boots, who is a tomcat. It's an extremely wild gin, as in Oscar, foppish tone, but genuinely laugh out loud hysterical if you can get into it. Super bawdy, right? It's often called feminist, the book. Were she alive and writing today, she might keep the label. Probably, but she very well might not. Many modern feminists would, I'd wager, dislike Angela Carter. For sure. She has far more in common with Camille Paglia than with any modern feminist that I'm aware of. She was provocative, confrontational, unique, totally individual, really not into the whole group thing, and she could be quite cutting. For example, she suggested that Virginia Woolf and her Bloomsbury group were a bunch of tinkling, overprivileged freaks. That was just very funny. Anyways, God bless her. But for example, like Paglia, Carter was a huge proponent of the Marquis de Sade and his pornographic fictions, and philosophy, recognizing their intense power in a manner that, contrary to popular opinion, could actually be seen as quite liberating for women in a certain light. Power through sexual autonomy, and not only autonomy, of course, but fantastical, adventurous sexual excess in Sade. But, you know, there's a there's a lesson there. Because Sade, if you've never read Sade before, it's all, as long as you're over 18, go and do it. But it's wildly fantastical pornography, extremely explicit pornography, to the brink of one's imagination and beyond of what's like possible physically with bodies, right? It's absurd. But it's all mixed with very heavy atheistic philosophy. Now, his narratives are fantastically excessive and absurd, of course, but in that absurd realm were a lot, he dropped a whole bunch of bombs of truth, right? Very unconventional. I mean, like, totally radical for his time. Like Sade, Carter was all about, and this is why I love her, Carter was all about artistic disobedience with aesthetic flair and intellectual depth. Which of course baffled the gen pop of Carter's era, right? Both men and women, feminists and chauvinists. And in this spirit, she rewrote these classic fairy tales, actually inspired by her grandmother, who used to tell her these, at least some of these stories, I believe. Little Red Riding Hood for sure. But she was inspired by, you know, her grandmother's tone and voice, right? And apparently her grandmother was not, I think her grandmother didn't like censor it for her as a kid, so it was pretty dark, you know? Little Red Riding Hood did in fact get eaten. So that made it more enjoyable for her, I think, because it was scary or, you know, more frightening, more of a dramatic memory of grandma. There are 10 stories in the collection, beginning with the titular The Bloody Chamber, which is a retelling of the folktale Bluebeard, about the newlywed wife who discovers the secret room in her wealthy husband's castle. It's an exceptional story and the longest in the collection. He's like the richest man in France, maybe? It's as though he lives in Normandy at the castle at Mont Saint-Michel, where the tide comes in and recedes, allowing passage and retracting it daily. It's a hell of an environment. This wealthy businessman, who is her husband with a dark secret, has an edition of Huysmans là-bas. Seems like, kind of gives off the air of being a very rich occultist or Satanist. Carmilla is also referenced as being the name of one of Bluebeard's former wives. The writing is decadent, sultry, sensual, terrific. Great book. Great story. In the story, Angela Carter essentially displays the downsides to being a fabulously rich young housewife. After her husband leaves for business, she's stuck in this enormous castle with absolutely nothing meaningful to do. Sure, there's some novelty, food, piano, but after that, she's trapped. And the feminine personality being trapped, caged, dying to be free, is the theme coursing through the veins of this collection. This almost certainly came from Carter's unhappy marriage of, I think, 12 years, broken by her stint in subsequent personal transformation in Tokyo, when she won the Somerset Maugham Award and was given some money and went over there and was only going to stay for a little bit, but ended up staying for a couple years and just completely had her life changed. That's a place that'll do it, by the way. If any of you actually want a mind-altering existential experience, I'd still wager, if you grew up in the West and you want to get way out of the world that you're familiar with, go spend 3 months in Tokyo, or better yet, a year. It's a wonderful place. It'll fuck your whole shit up, man. I mean, it is a serious. It is a place to go and think about who the hell you are. So moving on to the book. The Courtship of Mr. Lion, or Mr. Lion, is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. Not the best for me, but not the worst. Definitely reminded me more of Jean Cocteau's version, which is certainly worth a viewing, and more than one if you've never had the pleasure. Has the same fellow from his Orphic trilogy. I forget the name of the actor. Great French actor. The ones in this collection I wasn't particularly impressed by were The Tiger's Bride, about a woman gambled away by her father to a silent, masked, wealthy man, who also turns out to be part feline, and The Snow Child, which was kind of a very short, odd Freudian nightmare. These aren't as strong nor developed as the eponymous story The Bloody Chamber. The Lady of the House of Love is the story of a young British officer traveling through Eastern Europe who comes across the house of a withered and deeply depressed female vampire. That was great. I really enjoyed that one. The Werewolf is a short precursor to The Company of Wolves, a dark retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, as I said, which was adapted into a feature-length film in the 80s directed by Neil Jordan, who later did Interview with the Vampire. And Angela Carter worked with him on the script for the adaptation for The Company of Wolves. The Company of Wolves is an excellent film. I've linked it below. Excellent soundtrack as well by George Fenton. I love the viola or whatever that is. It has this kind of like, folk horror thing. Truly unique 80s folk horror film. Nice cameo from Terrence Stamp as the devil as well. Definitely for fans of the original Wicker Man with Christopher Lee. It's one of my favorite films. Upon rereading this now, the new one to stand out to me was The Earl King, which is about a woman who has some kind of relationship with this entity of the woods, this king of the forest. It's a strange, dreamlike story of forest witchcraft, flesh mixing with wood and earth and leaves. A kingdom of animals surrounds this guy. Outstanding pagan nature writing. A tale of nature's ill nature. The Earl King, I discovered in this documentary I've linked below, is actually based on her second husband, 15 years her junior or so, I think. Puss in Boots is the most verbose, slow-moving, and difficult to read, but contains the best humor in the entire collection. I went out of order for some of these. All the wolf ones are at the end of the collection. So finally, the collection ends with the story of a young girl raised by wolves in a tale called Wolf Alice. Ha, no pun intended. Tale. Wolf. After being dropped off at a convent and perplexing the nuns, they leave her at the doorstep of a local grave-robbing vampire cannibal guy who lives alone in this dilapidated mansion. And he and the wolf girl maintain kind of a strange but functional household of sorts. It's without being able to speak to one another because she doesn't speak. She has the sensibility of a wolf, yet the body of a human, and gradually it's kind of these two things fused. It's very interesting when Carter describes her perception of time, which is more that of a wolf, right? Everything is kind of, there's no past or future. Everything is present. That was cool, I thought. It's an odd one. Fascinating as a portrait of a woman who is half animal and half human. Inside the famous narrative frameworks of these fairy tales and folk tales, she was able to find and tell her own story. And nowhere is there a more demonstrable example of this strategy's ability to produce new genius works than in The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. That is one method, right? As Jean-Luc Godard said, it's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to. And I think if you're working with literature, archetypes, right? Books come from books, I think as McCarthy said, something of that nature. And I think it's legit. Her stories aren't anywhere near as graphic. You could call them darkly erotic, but they're not pornographic. They're not explicit. It's not vulgar. It's not sod. It's nowhere close. She's similar to Leonora Carrington, but wittier. I prefer Carter. Very funny, especially if you enjoy British humor, which I do. Very much so. As far as I'm concerned, The Company of Wolves is one of the greatest horror/fantasy stories ever written. That's not usually my thing at all, but it's so intelligently done. It's so well written. That's the thing. Carter can really write. Her word choice is impeccable. It's constructed beautifully. There's no lag time. I mean, it's really, yeah. So Red Riding Hood, not so little in this story, it has made a bet with a gentleman, a stranger, in the woods regarding who can reach her grandmother's house first. And so, of course, the gentleman, who is not what he seems, has reached it first and is waiting for her there when she arrives, and her grandmother is nowhere to be found. So he has not dressed up like her grandmother in the story, but rather he's just sitting there, after having done away with most of the evidence. Where's my grandmother? There's nobody here but we two, my darling. Now a great howling rose up all around them, near, very near, as close as the kitchen garden, the howling of a multitude of wolves. She knew the worst wolves are hairy on the inside, and she shivered. In spite of the scarlet shawl, she pulled more closely round herself, as if it could protect her, although it was as red as the blood she must spill. Who has come to sing us carols, she said. Those are the voices of my brothers, darling. I love the company of wolves. Look out of the window and you'll see them. Snow half caked the lattice, and she opened it to look into the garden. It was a white night of moon and snow. The blizzard whirled round the gaunt gray beasts who squatted on their haunches among the rows of winter cabbage, pointing their sharp snouts to the moon and howling as if their hearts would break. 10 wolves. 20 wolves. So many wolves she could not count them, howling in concert as if demented or deranged. Their eyes reflected the light from the kitchen and shone like 100 candles. It's good shit. It was a toss-up whether I was going to read from The Bloody Chamber or this one. They're both excellently written. While I'm a fan of Angela Carter, it's not necessarily always something I want to broadcast. There's a culture of circusy, fantasy, steampunky, something or other that, drool over the surface level aesthetic employed by her. Very Portland. People that, with all due respect, I've known in my past and feel I have little in common with. I don't think they would understand her stylistic origins and influences, which are completely contrary to political correctness. I mean, Freud, Sade. These men are not traditionally heralded as icons of feminism. In fact, precisely the opposite. But she got all of them. She got all of them and was fascinated by them. And she took inspiration from everywhere. Like, she didn't give a fuck. Right? That's the thing about Carter and why I love her. She didn't fucking care what people think. You want to talk about like female authors who really just went against the grain and just like didn't give a fuck what anybody thought about them. Like she's like, I mean, and forget just female authors, just authors in general. Like you want to talk about like authors who were pretty punk for their era? I mean, absolutely. But she was also like competent, She was also she could actually back it up because she was actually good, right? It wasn't just bluster. It wasn't just raging against convention for the sake of it, necessarily. She could back it up because she was actually a terrific author. And, just crack this book open and it's perfectly demonstrable. I mean, like, it's excellent writing. So, there you go. Angela Carter is a master of the English language. You can spot traces of Wilde, possibly Bronte. Either of the sisters, I think. I was thinking Emily, actually, because I haven't read Charlotte. But then I learned that at the time of her death, which was tragically early, unfortunately, she got lung cancer from a lot of smoking in her early 50s and passed away in 1992. But at the time of her death, she was actually working on a sequel, right? A sequel to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which I have not read yet, but I will. I loved Emily Bronte. I loved Wuthering Heights. But Carter constructs gorgeous sentences gilded to outrageous excess. Some stories are better or worse than others for this. But in the way of like, how would you describe it? It's not pretension for pretension's sake. It's as if you were to go to a Michelin star restaurant and you sit down and are served and you plop the ridiculously ornate food into your mouth, expecting to say something like, God, honestly, I just wanted a burrito. All critical and cynical and whatever. But instead, the food is actually just as good as it claims to be. So you're just like, oh, fuck, wow, amazing. You can't dismiss it all as like pomp, right? It's not in vogue these days to write in this manner, and it might have been even less so back then in the 70s. But her style, while ostentatious, is remarkably impressive. It's great fucking writing, as she might say. She indulges in ornate literary style as one indulges in narcotic or erotic vice. That is, to deliberate and marvelously grand excess. She's a writer of luxurious form, excess with a purpose, used to reach a state of storytelling not found in today's pithy economical minimalists. She couldn't care less. Mythic, eerie, erotic, bleeding sensuality. The whole collection is filled with good old-fashioned, sumptuous, decadent sentences, all with a kind of self-aware humor, as if she's indeed aware of the silliness she's producing, but insofar also capable of great storytelling. After all, as she put it, okay, I write old, blown, purple, self-indulgent prose. So fucking what? Precisely. Antiquated English literature fused with a 70s punk rock attitude. All of that leads to a style completely her own, inimitable, yet colossally influential. But everybody else fails at it, save her. Because it's her personality, right? As it is with all authors. It's the essence of a person captured and demonstrated on the page. Not trapped, but rather imbued. As if like a perfume or a curse or a hex. That's what a book is. It's a captured piece of a person's soul, traveling through time and left to haunt those who remain. It's a glorious form of immortality, because in its patient and dutiful construction, the author is allowed to be the best that they can be. They can represent themselves how they truly are, instead of posterity trusting only the dubious sources of their associates or, God forbid, their family. One should trust no one but the person. There's something pure in her prose underneath the fluff. A wicked intelligence, razor-sharp British wit, humor, and sensibility. English culture at its best. Better than food. Check it out. So you should read it. I'd say if you're a fan of Oscar Wilde, Jorge Luis Borges, and maybe J.G. Ballard, then you ought to check her out, for sure. She's weird, man. And also Wittkop. I think if you like Wittkop, you'll enjoy this. Yeah, if you're a fan of the English Gothic novel, or Poe, I think she was definitely inspired by Poe, or fantastical literature, you can't lose. It's like essential reading. Coffee time. For those of you who are new, thank you very much for stopping by and watching. I take the names of all the patrons on Patreon who have donated $5 or more per video to the show. I place their names in this mason jar, and for every review, I pull out a name, and whoever's name I pull out is sent a hard copy of the book I'm reviewing, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And the coffee is delicious, currently from Nicaragua. If you would like to get in on that and help support the show, thank you very much. You can click on the link below or go to patreon.com/books are better than food and donate $5 more per video. Once again, like I said in the last review, the $1 tier is being phased out, so that will stop on the 1st of January 2024, so I'd highly suggest any of the other tiers. And international shipping is included. Thank you very much to all patrons, and best of luck. Okay, here we go. Adrian S. Thank you very much, Adrian. Really appreciate it. You're going to receive The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter, plus a bag of coffee roasted by yours truly. And I hope you love both. Happy Halloween. Cheers. Please subscribe if you have not already, and hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and always remember,
Die reading.
take care of yourselves. Have a great night. Happy Halloween. Talk to you soon. Ciao.